Hi guys, my name's Rob and I'm working on a wargame, but not your average wargame. My wargame is played with acorns. Let me explain. I love the hobby. Miniatures, painting, playing, kit bashing, the whole lot. The thing is, I live on a narrowboat and I don't really have the space to hoard stuff. Models, scenery, boards, general hobby detritus. So I've cut back massively since moving onto the boat. All of my hobbying, YouTubing, model making, everything is in this tiny engine room in the back of my boat. The problem is, arguably my favourite part of the hobby is model making, and unfortunately I just don't have the space to hoard bits for kit bashing. So one day, out of desperation really, I grabbed some twigs and a pine cone from outside and I made this little guy. Needless to say, after building that first model I was hooked, and soon after I started making other little twig people and then their own lore and world for them to live in. Before I knew it, I was writing a rulebook, and that's how my wargame started. A wargame that I'm currently calling Fae. So this channel is going to be an attempt at documenting my process developing Fae, and hopefully get some interest in the game while I'm at it. Right now I don't really have any grand plans for releasing the game. For me it's just a fun hobby project that's kind of got a little bit out of hand. But as I'm enjoying the process so much, I thought other people might too. So in this first video I'm going to show you my process for making a Fae. It's not quite a kit bash, so I thought I might call it
So when nature bashing, you want to start off by collecting a load of different materials. I've organised mine in these separator boxes, and that helps a lot when trying to find the right piece when you need it. When collecting, you also want to make sure you get a variety of sizes of each item, as well as a range of different species of the same item. Some species will be much larger, and these can be good to break up for smaller parts. Some will be the perfect scale to use as is, so just try and find specimens that are in good condition. Older specimens can sometimes have really interesting shapes, so long as they're durable enough to use in a build. Newer specimens tend to be a lot more durable and have completely different shapes to their mature forms. And sometimes you'll find specimens which seem to be of the same species but look wildly different. So when I start a build, I try and find a specimen that has a cool shape or feature. This pine cone still had a bit of twig attached, which to me looked a little bit like a neck, and that was all I needed to get started. So I attached this 3D printed head that I'd sculpted, and I really liked the weird hunched over pose it gave. However, I wanted to fill in some of the space under the neck, and holding up an acorn to the space, it kind of reminded me of a courgette. With that little spark of an idea, I began shaping an acorn half until it fit snugly under the neck. After test fitting, I then realised I'd need to balance out the form on the other side of the neck, so I shaped the other half of the acorn to fit. I now wanted to make it look like the two pieces were strapped together, so I took some pine needles and used them as leather straps. Once I was happy with the pieces, I glued them all in place. With my tiny set of armour started, the next piece to tackle was the pauldrons. After layering some acorn halves, I then wanted to make them look stitched together like you see on samurai armour. Once again I used pine needles, crimping them so they wouldn't snap when I bent them over on themselves. I fed the needles through the holes I'd drilled, and then glued them in place from the other side. The last piece of armour would be the chest plate, which I'd make out of 2 more acorns. Again, I cut and shaped the parts and created the breastplate by sanding a gouge with a hand file. The hardest part here was finding the right size pieces that fit within each other neatly to create the chest features. Small tweaks to the shapes allowed them to fit better with one another, and rounding off the edges made the armour look a little bit more intentional. I've got to say, this whole process was really relaxing and super fun to see come together at this scale. The materials are also really easy to work with, and the natural forms really inspire how the build comes together. Creating this little set of armour really got me thinking about all the different ways you can make small tweaks to this, using different materials or layering the pieces in different ways, and I think there's so much breadth to how you could customise your own force. With the armour set complete, I now started sanding it down to fit the model. I found using a cheap rotary tool like this super helpful when making these models. I think in a pinch you could build a whole fay using just this tool and a range of different rotary attachments. This might be something I explore in a future video, as the idea of using just a few basic tools along with free natural materials really lowers the barrier of entry into this hobby, which traditionally can be pretty expensive. Back to the model though, and we've finally got to the really satisfying part of assembling our different pieces together and seeing how it all works on the model. The chest piece fits really nicely and ties in with the gorget well. The pauldrons will serve double duty too, as they'll bulk out the form and hide the joints where we attach the arms. I tried a few different options for the arms, but ended up designing to keep it really simple and just use some pine twigs which had some really nice textures on them. I think sticking to using parts from the same plant really helps to keep the visual identity of the model cohesive. I'll try and integrate more of the pine needle aesthetic into the design as we go on. Next up was making the weapon, and rather than trying to sculpt something to look like a weapon in our world, I tried to think of what natural materials would be used as a weapon in theirs. Thorns were the obvious choice, so I tried to make a weapon from this bramble twig, making the least amount of changes to the original twig's shape as possible. My headcanon for this is that it's just a crude weapon made quickly with natural materials, so I want my build to reflect this using as much of the original twig as possible. It did make me think though, what about some of the other factions? What weapons would they use and how would they create them? Maybe the elves could grow their weapons, naturally shaping how the weapon looks, whereas the goblins would just use like jaws or teeth of small animals they found. I think there'd be loads of really cool contrast between the factions that way. I'm not really sure what faction this guy that I'm making belongs to, but that's kind of the fun of making this game for me. I'm just being creative and letting what I make then dictate the story. But back to the build, here you can see me gluing the weapon directly to the arms. I thought it might be easier to attach the hands around the weapon this way, as the hands were going to be so tiny. So this was the part I'd been dreading since beginning this build, as I really didn't know how I was going to make hands at this scale with natural materials. Keeping to my idea of continuing the pine needle aesthetic, I decided I'd try and use pine needles as the fingers. To my surprise, this actually worked quite well. The only thing I needed to do was sand them slightly to help them stick better. I capped off the messy tops of the hands with a tiny piece of acorn to make it kind of look like a gauntlet, and then I just had to repeat the process on the other hand. The last part of this build was to add some more details, and as I had gone pretty hard into the pine needle aesthetic already, I thought a little bit more couldn't hurt. Currently, the only part of the model I hadn't added to was the back, so I started putting some needles there. I didn't want to go overboard though, as I did really like the unarmoured look of the back, and I think it gave a good contrast with all the detail on the front.
So you might be wondering, Rob, why are you stopping? The guy still doesn't have any legs. Well, rest assured, I will make the legs. I just tried a few different things with natural materials and they didn't really have the look that I was looking for. I want like a double jointed leg that has quite a lot of detail. So I thought the best way to create that would be using a different process. And that process starts with the 3D scanner.
So I get access to a whole range of 3D scanners through my work. And for this project, I thought I'd try using the Einstar Vega. It's going to be an interesting test because the Vega is actually designed to be used portably on large items such as engine bays or car body interiors. So using this stationary to scan something this small is really going to put the Vega through its paces. To increase my chance of getting a successful print, I've put my model on a lazy Susan so I can rotate it smoothly, and then I've added some pillars with tracking markers on them. These help reference the model in 3D space as you rotate the lazy Susan, stopping the scanner from losing track of the object as you move it. The main issue I'm fighting against here is keeping the model within the scanner's depth of field. In normal use, you would just move the scanner towards or away from the object, but I'm mounted to a tripod here, so it's not an option. Luckily though, it seems like I managed to get a decent scan thanks to the markers and the lazy Susan. The only issue now though is I need to delete away the pillars from my scan. This is super easy with the Vega though, as it has built-in mesh editing. This kind of post-processing would traditionally have been done on a computer, so it's super convenient being able to do this locally on the Vega. The next step is taking the data, which is currently just a point cloud, and converting it into a mesh. Again, this is all able to be done locally, speeding up the scanning process massively. Now I can finally see the scan, and to be honest, I'm blown away. I really didn't think I was even going to be able to get a scan at this scale, let alone get the detail that I'm seeing here. Obviously the scan isn't perfect and some of the details are a little bit muddy, but it's pretty amazing to me that a scanner that isn't actually designed for this kind of scale of scanning is able to achieve something like this. It's really just a testament to the quality of this scanner and the versatility of a tool like this. With the scanner out and already set up, I decided to scan in a few more items, and I'm glad I did because I end up using them in the next stage of this design process. With my scans complete, I now needed to transfer the files from my Vega to the desktop. This is a simple process using OnStar's mesh editing suite. As we've already done the mesh editing on the Vega though, all we need from this program is the export option. I transfer the file as an STL onto my hard drive. Then I can open it up on my iPad in Nomad Sculpt. Nomad Sculpt is a really great beginner friendly soft modelling program, which has all the tools we need for the next step of this modelling journey. I begin by reorientating the model so it's aligned with my scene. Then the last bit of prep work is to use the trim tool to cut away the paper clip that was holding the model when I scanned it. I now started the long and daunting task of refining the scan. The first step was to use the crease tool to refine the edge details. I went around the model working on one area at a time, just trying to roughly define the edges. The next step was to use the stamp tool to add some texture back into the model. I would stamp and smooth until I got a level of texture I was happy with. I then used the crease tool again to start adding in some extra details. I did another texture pass with the stamp tool to create a bit more variation in the surface, and then went back and did some final bits of edge refinement with the crease tool. So I just continued around the model using these same tools in the same way. It was pretty amazing how much you could get done with just a few tools in this program, and the only thing I was really being conscious of was the fact that this model was going to be tiny when it actually printed it. Because of this, I needed to really define all of the edges of the model so that when somebody was painting it at this scale, it would be really clear to see where the different parts of the model started and where they ended. So once I'd refined the majority of the model, I then turned my attention to the weapon. Unfortunately, this hadn't really scanned very well, so I decided I was going to re-sculpt a lot of this with the tools in Nomad. I began by cutting off the spikes that were already there. I then started making my own spikes by using a primitive shape, which was the cone, and then I used the clay tool to just add a bit of different variation. I flattened off the top because when you're 3D printing you don't really want any super sharp points, and then I cloned this spike and kind of moved it around to fit in where the old spikes were. I used the move tool to kind of warp and shape them so all the spikes were slightly different. I took this opportunity to kind of change the scale of the spikes because on my original model they were a little bit big for the scale of the fade that was holding it, so I kind of scaled them down a little bit. I then started working on the wraps just using the clay tool to create the shape of the wraps. They were quite rough, but the scale we printed it at, it came out great. The final step was just to refine the shape of these wraps slightly and then combine all of the separate parts back into the model. So now we're going to move on to the legs, and we're going to be sculpting this pretty much from scratch. Bear in mind I've only been using Nomad for about a month and I've never done any digital sculpting before this, so definitely don't take this as a tutorial. This is just the workflow that I've worked out over the last month or so. So I begin by creating a rough model of the shape that I want to create using the tube tool. This lets me quickly check the size and pose before going deep into the details of the model. Then, because I want to be able to use these legs in different poses later down the line, I create a new model where I can make each joint of the leg a separate primitive. This will allow me to repose the leg and reuse it on other models rather than just being locked into one specific pose. I use the cylinder primitive to block out these shapes, using my original model as a reference for size and positioning. I then refine the shape of these cylinders with the move tool to start roughing out the muscle shapes. To refine the shapes more, I used a flatten tool to flatten off the sharp edges of the cylinders, as well as define the muscle shapes a little bit further. I moved back and forth between the flatten and move tool using different reference images to make sure the anatomy looks somewhat correct. Now I import the pine cone that I scanned earlier and position it to replace the top joint of the leg, reshaping it slightly to fit. With the added detail of the pine cone, the legs are now looking a bit too smooth, so I go back and sculpt in extra detail using the clay tool. By using the clay tool subtractively, I'm able to create more defined muscles, then use the move tool to get them scaled correctly. I'm sure if I was a bit more of a competent sculptor, I wouldn't need to do so much back and forth when sculpting, but that's the beauty of digital sculpting. It's so easy to make edits and changes on the fly. With my leg complete, I make a mirrored copy of it, and then, using my initial rough sculpts as a guide, I move the new legs into position, finally completing my model.
So here is the final model. As you can see, I've 3D printed the legs that I sculpted in Nomad, and because I was working directly off the scan, they're perfectly scaled to my model. Arguably though, the biggest benefit of scanning and sculpting a digital version of the model is that now I can print out as many of them as I would like, and you guys can too. I'm going to be releasing the STL for this model, free in the description down below. I'm hoping that if you get your hands on one of these little guys, it will inspire you guys to go out and have a go at nature bashing yourselves. I've left the head on this model separate for just that purpose, so if you're feeling super brave, you can build your own body for him. If you do a build, please be sure to tag me on Instagram, and again, I'll leave the link to my Instagram down below. So this whole workflow has been pretty mind-blowing for me. The fact I'm able to do all of this with consumer-grade products and software is a complete game changer. I could even see a small business justify the cost of the scanner in this workflow. I mean, if you find a creative use for it, like I have, I think it gives you something really unique and brings back a bit of the physicality in miniatures that can so easily be lost in this modern age of digital sculpting. I think for my next build, I'll actually build it a lot bigger. This will let the scanner get a lot more detail, and when I eventually scale it down to its miniature size, it will look even more refined. So if you want to see me do that, make sure you're subscribed, and if you want to follow me in the meantime, go sign up for my Instagram where I post pictures of my builds and the development of my game. But until next time, get outside and get crafting.